Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight, the last one of 2025 before we take a well-deserved Christmas break. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jake Gasson. Jake is a National Army Museum Fellow based at King's College London, where he works on the Second World War service records of the British and Commonwealth armies. He holds a DPhil from Pembroke College, Oxford, focusing on the Macedonian front during the First World War, which received the André Courvoisier Prize from the International Commission for Military History. Today, Jake will explore the unique challenges faced by British soldiers serving on the Salonika front during the First World War. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audience, you can post questions in the chat bar, and these will be put to our speaker at the end of the talk. For our in-person audience, raise your hand and I'll bring round this microphone. Moving on with some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. If a member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all being said, I'm now going to hand over to Jake and hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you.
So thank you. Can you hear me on the mic? Right, great. So thank you all very much for coming. It's good because this is the second year in a row you get me for the pre-Christmas slot looking at the Salonika front. But today in this talk, what I'm focusing on is British soldiers' experiences of serving in a multinational army on, of course, what is one of the still forgotten fronts. But first, before we examine the dynamics of coalition warfare on the ground, a bit of context. So by the Salonika or Macedonian front, we're talking about a theatre of operations in what is today the Republic of North Macedonia and northern Greece. Its name comes from Salonika, modern-day Thessaloniki, which served as the Allied base for the campaign. And the campaign began in October 1915, when British and French troops first landed in what was really a very belated and inadequately resourced attempt to prevent the destruction of Serbia. Because their Serbian ally in 1914 had repelled 3 Austro-Hungarian invasions, but it had come at a terrible cost. There was losses in manpower and materiel fighting off the invasions, but there was also a typhus epidemic that swept the country in the winter of 1914 and 1915. And weakened by its exertions, Serbia faced the prospect of a 4th invasion, but this time by the combined forces of Austria, Germany, and Bulgaria. And the British and French, they failed to prevent the destruction of Serbia, but they remained, they built up their forces, and eventually the campaign drags in most of the belligerents on both sides. So for the Central Powers, it's primarily Bulgarian troops that are fighting, but there's also German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman contingents as well. For the Allies, it's a French-led multinational army of French, British, Serbian, Greek, Italian, and Russian troops, as well as troops from across the British and French colonial empires, including from India, from West Africa, from Indochina, and North Africa. But to understand coalition warfare at Salonika, we need to start by outlining 2 high-level dynamics. So the first of these is the centrality of the Anglo-French relationship to the campaign. Because for British political and military decision-makers, there was no enthusiasm for getting involved at Salonika. So the French, for their part, were enthusiastic supporters. In the context of the latter half of 1915, it provided an opportunity to employ the man on the screen, General Maurice Sorais, who had been sacked from his command on the Western Front in July 1915, because he was a very well-connected Republican general, and so it caused a controversy when he was sacked. The French also sought, by deploying to Salonika, to facilitate their own longer-term economic and territorial expansion in the Eastern Mediterranean. Amongst the British, though, there was little enthusiasm for a Balkan expedition. Only the belief that maintaining the Anglo-French alliance rested on deploying to Salonika compelled the British government to eventually send 5 divisions by the end of 1915, start of 1916. And this mismatch in motivations left the British subject to the whims of the French, and with very little room to carve out their own policy. So an official memorandum in December 1916 summarised the campaign as, quote, one long story of the British government acting against its better judgment in the interest of the other allies, and of being impelled thereby to reject the advice of the British General Staff. The second dynamic at play is that of the national schism in Greece between these two men on the screen, because there's an antagonistic relationship between the Allies and the royalist Greek government between October 1915 and June 1917. So British and French troops have been invited to Salonika by Greece's pro-Allied Prime Minister, the man on the left, Eleftherios Venizelos, who sought to engineer Greece's entry into the First World War. But this was opposed by the man on the right, his monarch, King Constantine I. So he was married to the German Kaiser's sister and was personally a Germanophile. So he wanted to maintain neutrality in the expectation of an eventual German victory. In the face of Constantine's unwavering opposition, Venizelos actually resigns just as the first Anglo-French forces arrive off Salonika. But then this is too late for the government that succeeds him to stop them disembarking on the 5th of October 1915. And the uncertain position that results from this, where you have the Allies on neutral Greek soil with a monarch who they believe is pro-German, but they believe that he's engineering things for the Germans. This sets the stage for years of tension and even outright conflict. So at the end of 1916, British and French Marines end up fighting Greek troops in the streets of Athens. And so the division, though, between these two men, the important thing for this talk, is entrenched in 1916. Because after Constantine fails to oppose a Bulgarian invasion of northern Greece, a military coup in Salonika leads to the establishment of a rival government headed by Venizelos, who sends troops to fight with the Allies. And then events culminate in Constantine's abdication in June 1917 in response to an Allied ultimatum. And as a result, Venizelos returns as the Prime Minister of a reunited Greece, and the entire country enters the war on the Allied side. But the starting point for the talk is this, because for generals and politicians, fighting as part of such a diverse and multinational coalition created tensions when determining strategy and orchestrating battles. Sir William Robertson, the chief of the Imperial General Staff between 1916 and 1918, described the Allied force as a military salad, an undoubted pun on the French word for Macedonia. And he was a fierce critic of deploying troops away from the Western Front, and he believed that political decision-makers didn't understand the complexities of conducting a campaign in such a diverse coalition. Yet the difficulties extended beyond the generals and politicians. British soldiers had to live and fight alongside their allies on the ground. Coalition warfare for them meant engaging with counterparts who often greatly differed in values, beliefs, and interests, not to mention in military practices. So in this paper, I want to explore how these varied on and off the battlefield for the men of the British Salonika Force, as the British contingent was known. And I want to begin by considering inter-Allied encounters in Salonika, the Allied base of the campaign, and from there look at two of the really definitive episodes of coalition warfare on the battlefield, both of which helpfully bookend the campaign. So the first is the advance into Serbia between October and December 1915, and the second is the combined Anglo-Greek operations around Doiran in September 1918, a bloody defeat on the battlefield that nonetheless paved the way for Allied victory in Macedonia. So if we start with Salonika. Salonika was the Allied base of the campaign. The city had only become part of Greece in 1912 after the First Balkan War, when it had been conquered from the Ottoman Empire, and it had a diverse multi-ethnic population of Jews, Muslims, and Greeks. And in 1916, the population was around 170,000. But Salonika was transformed by the arrival of the Allied troops. Camps, depots, and hospitals sprung up on the outskirts. In the city itself, Allied troops wandered the streets, and they visited its cafes, restaurants, and brothels. And the visual pageantry of the Allies captivated British soldiers. The sight of British, French, Russian, Italian, Greek, Serbian soldiers, as well as those from the colonial empires of the British and French, was a source of wonderment. And if you read the letters, diaries, and memoirs, all of them feature very broadly similar descriptions like the one on screen of all the armies alongside one another. So the man on screen, Private H.J. Youngman, wrote in his memoir, "And what a polyglot army we were. the Serbs, the Greeks, the Italians, the French plus their colonial troops, the brigade of Russians, the British with various odds and ends from our empire and colonies, all combined to form a motley crowd such as never was before. But soldiers didn't just gaze on their allies, they instinctively assessed them, because fighting in a coalition was aimed at winning the war, and men wanted to know that their allies could actually contribute to this. And away from the battlefield and the streets of Salonika, soldiers looked for signs in their uniforms, their equipment, their discipline, their drill, because they all provided clues into how these allies would then perform on the battlefield. And of course, the British were sure of their own military abilities. They were sure that they set the standard for what soldiers should be. And this cultivated a sort of military hierarchy where the British positioned themselves at the top and then highlighted the inadequacies of all the others. So the man on screen, Major C.E. Norton, considered that the French, quote, were the most slovenly and dirty collection of men. The other nationals were all right, but the really smart troops were the British. And what's really notable is that the colonial troops occupied a particularly ambiguous position within the military hierarchy. So on the screen, we have a postcard that was produced for the Christmas in 1916. And as you can see at the back row, second from the left, you have a French North African troop. Then third from the right, you have a British Indian soldier. And then in the front row, second from left, you have a tirailleur Senegalese. And then second from the right, on the other side, you have a French Indo-Chinese soldier. And these men, they were rarely assessed by British soldiers on their military prowess, because more commonly they were just seen as curiosities. So for the Indo-Chinese soldiers, many discussed their distinctive conical hats. And martial race theory likely underpinned a willingness to only praise their contributions prosecuting the war as labourers rather than soldiers. So one officer lauded the Annamites for constructing the French Officers' Club in Salonika, writing, quote, "If they did nothing else in the war, these strange, black-toothed auxiliaries of the French justified their existence by the refreshing shade which they provided for the sun-weary." And of course, these men did fight at the front. It's just for the British, this wasn't something that factored into their impressions. But really interestingly is that some felt that the deployment of colonial troops in a European war reflected poorly on the Allied armies. So there's one individual who I found who really resented serving in a multinational army with colonial forces, because he wrote, quote, that it was a, quote, mongrel crowd against a highly civilized nation, whatever the crimes of the Germans may have been. Now, one of the most prominent opportunities for assessing other armies were the parades that took place through the city streets. So of note is the arrival of the Russian and Italian troops in August 1916, because the Russian 2nd Brigade and the Italian 35th Division marched through Salonika, disembarking, observed by contingents from all the other Allied armies. And standing in the crowd, the British instinctively assessed the new arrivals. And while prevailing attitudes in British society towards neither Russia nor Italy were positive, the initial impressions of the Italians were far from negative, and the Russians were overwhelmingly positive. So one described the Italians as, quote, short, sturdy men with a swinging stride, and took their ragged flags as signs of their combat experience. But because both the Russians and the Italians arrived at very similar times, you find that soldiers naturally compared the two. So the man on screen, Private G.H. Wilson, for instance, he contrasted the, quote, tall and broad-shouldered Russians, and then he positioned them above the, quote, small and slovenly Italians. Because interesting, they've again gone from the height as the sign of the Italians. But again, in both instances, he puts the British above them, because some days later, his battalion is marching past the Russian and Italian camps, and he says that they put on a special show of smartness to show them what the smartness in the British army is like. But coalition warfare in Salonika was not just a military phenomenon, because for men serving in the upcountry, away from the city, because of course, although it's the Salonika campaign, most of the fighting is far away from, or all of the fighting is far away from the city. Most men see very little of the city apart from when they arrive, and then occasionally they may go on leave if they're an officer, and then even rarer still is leave for the ordinary ranks. It's only really instituted in 1918. So when they get to the city, whether on leave or while on duty, It's a chance to seek out mental respite from the hardships of soldiering, the boredom, the harsh climate, the isolation. And so in the cafes, restaurants and concert halls, British soldiers formed friendships that transcended differences in language and culture. So most British soldiers could only speak English, but this did not divide them from their allies. And multicultural interactions were assisted by a degree of bemusement. So the quote on screen is an extract from a letter, which is really fascinating on this, because Private R.J. Bailey, he goes to a cafe, he sits next to a French gunner, an Italian cavalryman, and a Russian infantryman, so it sounds like the start of a joke. But this diverse group, they do converse with one another. The shouting and wild gesticulations, and then with pantomime and drawings and beer on the tabletop, they manage to make themselves understood. They manage to convey what their respective roles are. So Bailey picks up a beer bottle, he aims it at the violinist, and he goes, pop, pop, pop. And his French counterpart goes, ah, you're a machine gunner. And yes, he was. Then the Italian, he pretends to gallop in his chair, and he smacks the flank of his imaginary horse. Of course, he's a cavalryman. And of course, in these sort of interactions, you wouldn't be surprised now that alcohol is the big social glue here. So one favoured venue is the White Tower, which is still the symbol of Thessaloniki. It's on the quayside. And during the First World War, this hosted a concert hall and a restaurant. And inside, drunken soldiers joined together. They would sing, they'd climb from box to box, and engage in various bits of unruly behaviour to let loose. So they like to, rather than listen to the performances, they like to throw things at the people on stage as their favourite pastime. But on the other hand, the combination of soldiers seeking an escape from the oppressive boredom up country and combined with the readily available alcohol, it does lead to fights between the different Allied contingents. So there is some conflict trying to compete to enter the brothels, which you've got a picture on the left. But more interestingly, you find that some soldiers end up fighting the other Allies to defend their military reputation. So the quote on the right, you have Gunner Illitid Davies, and he finds that the Greeks and the Italians are claiming that it's them who are really winning the war. And so him and his comrades end up fighting them to defend the reputation of the British troops. But you really get conflict in the Great Fire of Salonika. So this breaks out on the 18th of August 1917. It destroys 32% of the city, leaves 79,000 homeless. And British soldiers contrast their own behaviour during the fire with that of their allies. So the British, they emerge as the paradigms of virtue, even if the exact charges laid against their allies vary considerably. So one believed that the French and Italian troops had turned to looting rather than fighting the flames, with the result that the fire spread and destroyed even more of the city. French sailors supposedly fought those who were trying to fight the flames. The Italians supposedly just marched out the city when the fire broke out. But it's the Russians that really suffer reputationally, because many record how the Russians turned to looting the alcohol from the restaurants that had been abandoned. And you even have one officer who records how he and his party end up having to shoot Russians who are raping local women in the streets. But coalition warfare, so you've got the dynamics of Salonika, but where it really matters is on the battlefield. So let us first look to the Anglo-French campaign in Serbia between October and December 1915, because in this first spell of operations during the Salonika campaign, you have two relationships that begin. Firstly, the British encounter the Serbian army for the first time, and secondly, they also have to learn to fight alongside the French in the Balkans for the first time. So the advance into Serbia comes amidst the fourth invasion suffered by the country since the outbreak of war. If you remember, the British and French troops, they arrive on the 5th of October. The next day, the 6th of October, the Austro-German forces begin to bombard Belgrade. On the 14th of October, Bulgaria casts off its neutrality and enters the war by invading southeastern Serbia. So the French, commanded by General Maurice Sarai, they push north up the Vardar River shortly after arriving, engaging the Bulgarian Second Army and dragging off pressure away from the Serbians. But British troops under Lieutenant General Sir Brian Mahon, they're initially forbidden from moving beyond the environs of the city. Belatedly, he's given permission to move to the Greek frontier and then to cross into Serbia. So he assembles a force from the 10th Irish Division, which is the first British formation to land at Salonika. It's just come from Gallipoli. He sends a force from that, and then eventually the rest of the division is sent when more British troops arrive at Salonika. And then during the night of the 21st to the 22nd of November, the British enter the front lines, taking over a line between Costarino and Lake Doiran. And we have Lake Doiran on the right-hand side, and then you've got the British troops, the red bits on the screen. But if we begin with the Serbians, so British soldiers, they arrive with an immediate cultural barrier to trying to actually work with the Serbians, because Serbia had a pretty poor reputation in contemporary British society. This resulted, above all, from a coup in 1903, which had entailed the assassination of King Alexander I of the Obrenović dynasty, who was then replaced by King Peter I, the Karađorđević dynasty. And it was only Serbia's successes against the Ottomans in the First Balkan War in 1912 to 1913, and in the Second Balkan War against the Bulgarians in 1913, that served to really improve the impression of Serbia in British eyes. And generally, too, you have to remember that during this period, and indeed up to this day in many cases, the Balkans were seen in British society as this primitive, uncivilized and barbaric region, and British soldiers had to overcome this to work with the Serbians. But when they actually come face to face with the Serbians, although these interactions are far from common, they actually reach a really positive assessment of what they see. So one officer, Captain Noel Edmund Drury, whose papers are here at the museum, he was, quote, surprised to see such fine-looking men, smartly dressed and in such good form. And you can see there his surprise. So it's the gulf between pre-war preconceptions and what he's actually seeing firsthand. And again, you do get some bemusement when these two nations are trying to interact with one another. Communication was difficult. Some found that the Serbians only spoke a little French and, of course, no English. So one account I've read features British bemusement at a Serbian soldier who relies upon noises and hand gestures. But one of the really interesting dimensions is that they come face to face with the fact that Serbia is being defeated. British soldiers were well aware that Bulgaria was advancing and that the Serbs were retiring eventually over the Albanian mountains towards the Adriatic. As they moved towards the front, men passed columns of refugees. Major Arthur Hamilton Gibbs later wrote that, quote, "From time to time, we met refugees trudging behind ox-drawn wagons with everything they possessed in the world, including their babies, sad-faced, wild-looking peasants, clad in picturesque rags of all colours, with eyes that had looked upon fear." So now, of course, what men see with their own eyes, what they hear secondhand, is not exactly conducive to thinking that the Serbians are effective soldiers. But what really prevents defeat from affecting assessments of the Serbians as soldiers was that they don't attribute defeat to any failings on the Serbians' part. So one officer later writes after the campaign of, quote, "the gallant little Serbian army offering so stubborn a resistance to the invading Austro-German Bulgar forces." Because in British society at the time, there was this trope of gallant Serbia that had come out of the operations of 1914 when the Serbians had repelled the Austro-Hungarian invasions. So Serbia was recast as this morally virtuous and capable wartime ally. And then this, it seems, continues amongst the troops who actually are in country in 1915. But the second and most important relationship that's built during this period is that with the French. It replicates the same process of acclimatisation which had ensued when the British Expeditionary Force had arrived in France in 1914. Because, of course, the 10th Irish Division, they'd been at Gallipoli, so they hadn't actually encountered the Serbian army on the battlefield because they were at Suvla Bay rather than at Cape Helles. And so misunderstandings, they did occur. So there's one incident where British soldiers or British officers, they're trying to visit their neighbouring French positions. They're arrested as potential spies. But when they clear things out, the French are welcoming hosts. They give them wine and they sort of regaling tales of recent operations. Others criticise the French for a lack of cleanliness, which is something that you see throughout the campaign. So on taking over a hospital established in the mosque of the village of Tatali, Private Wilfred Knott of the 32nd Field Ambulance recorded with disgust that they had, quote, left it in a filthy state, old dressings, rubbish, and the floors thick with dust. But really, you do find that impressions are positive of the French. They assess the French as soldiers, and they come to a welcome conclusion. So they size them up, and the French generally appear a worthy ally. In his memoir, Lieutenant George William Taylor, who I've quoted on screen, he gushes in his praise, quote, "I cannot speak too highly of the French, who are magnificent in adapting themselves to these novel conditions. And as for their fighting qualities, it is unnecessary for me to laud them, as all the world knows how fine they are. French weaponry seems particularly worthy of praise. Their artillery, machine guns, and equipment all appear excellent, and in some cases superior to that of the British." There are complaints, though. So one source of complaint is the positions, because the British are taking them over from the French. And these comprised of sangers, which are stone breastworks built up above the ground, which appeared to be offering inadequate protection compared to the trenches that the British supposedly themselves dig when they take over. So on the surface, this is a minor tactical disagreement, but it reflects the self-confidence of the British. Because on the Western Front, the men of the Kitchener's new armies, the civilians in uniform, they arrive and they're eager to learn from the French. But having fought at Gallipoli, the men of the 10th Irish Division are sure of their own military abilities. Rather than defer to the French, they're prepared to criticise when they think the French don't meet the standards required. Although, of course, in this sense, it must be said that the criticism was unfair, because the British themselves then rely on sangers, because the ground is too rocky to dig trenches and dugouts. But the main source of criticism is when they're trying to conduct joint operations. Because at the operational and tactical level, inter-allied cooperation requires establishing harmony between armies that differ in language, doctrine, and equipment. And adjoining armies need to liaise to coordinate operations. And in Serbia, tacit expectations of open communication, they come up against the tendency of the French seemingly towards unilateral action. So Captain Noel Drury, he served as the adjutant of the 6th Battalion Royal Irish Fusiliers, and he was exasperated by the French. They'd launch operations without informing the British. They try and interfere in the administration of British units. So on one occasion, a French brigade asks for a copy of a British battalion move order, and this provokes the furious tirade in his journal on the screen, where he's not only criticising the French themselves for being filthy, but he also rails against the selfishness of the French nation itself. But in early December 1915, the context in which the British appraise the French drastically changes, because the position of the French further north, astride the Vardar River, becomes very precarious and superfluous as the Bulgarians defeat the Serbians and then drive them into Kosovo, with Serbia overrun and its defeated armies starting to retire over the Albanian mountains. Any hope of stemming the invasion evaporated. General Maurice Sarai ordered his forces to prepare to withdraw, and on the 3rd of December, a general retreat south begins. And entrenched at the rear, you have the 10th Irish Division and the French 156th Division, and these were to remain in situ and then withdraw on the 14th of December. The Bulgarians, however, didn't conform to this timeline. Preempted by days of ranging and searching fire, on the 6th of December, large numbers of Bulgarian infantry attacked the British positions along Costarino Ridge, and this forces them to steadily withdraw back towards Greece. And as British troops are withdrawing, officers searched for a scapegoat. Some considered the French a suitable solution. So Lieutenant Colonel Henry Francis Udigate-Jourdain, who commanded the 5th Battalion Connaught Rangers and whose diaries are in the collection here at the museum, he felt that the French bore part of the blame for his battalion being driven from their positions. Because enemy action had prevented his men from strengthening their defences, they had occupied what he considered inferior and badly sited positions constructed by the French and earlier British units, and which were vulnerable to enemy artillery. But on the other hand, the men at the sharp end of the retreat, they found little to criticise. The French appeared an asset, not a hindrance, because men assessed their ally based on the assistance that the French gave them in times of need. So the French artillery that had been so praised previously, the 75mm field gun, it was praised for clearing the Bulgarian artillery that had otherwise threatened the British line of retreat. Some fought in rearguard actions alongside the French, and these sort of minor tactical successes where they could praise the artillery and infantry, which were irrelevant to the outcome of the campaign because the British and French had been driven from Serbian soil, they provided the means for British soldiers to interpret their experiences of coalition warfare positively. And the result was that by the 12th of December, the entirety of the 10th Irish Division had safely crossed back into Greece, and then it continued towards Salonika, where other British and French troops were already digging in around the city. But if the British soldiers ultimately considered the French were the allies, what did the French think of the British? So the answer is that it was far more mixed. So the British appeared to some French soldiers to bear at least part of the blame for the defeat in Serbia. Because even before the defeat at the Battle of Costarino, the French received news from Bulgarian deserters of the numerical weakness of the British, and this reinforced an impression they already had. And the result is that when the British are driven from their positions at the Battle of the Costarino, the French weren't taken aback by this. And one officer, who I've quoted on screen, in his diary that's published after the war, he wrote of discussing the reasons for the poor performance of British troops with an anonymous British general, who admitted that the 10th Irish Division were poorly trained, the officers young, given their heavy casualties at Gallipoli, and that the men of the division had not been together long enough to develop regimental esprit de corps, which in all is quite a prescient assessment of the situation. It's something that I've found in sort of researching British morale, because morale in the 10th Irish Division does really collapse at Costarino in December 1915. But on the other hand, in the footnote to his fascinating published diary, he admitted that the French, quote, always had the best relations with them and appreciated their great qualities. We know all the foresight, tenacity, and methodical approach they can display, something that he cites in relation to the evacuation of Gallipoli in 1916. But he does also have a really interesting comment where he's discussing it with an officer from the 10th Irish Division, and it really sums up things in Serbia, because this officer from the Irish Division goes, well, that's the difficulty of fighting in a coalition. If things go well, your ally takes all the credit. If things go badly, you get all the blame. And that does really sum it up. But for the final section of this talk, I want to shift chronologically from the start of the campaign to the end of the campaign. So first, we need to set the scene a little bit, because after withdrawing from Serbia, British and French troops had entrenched around Salonika in the so-called birdcage line, while the Bulgarians remained on the Greek frontier, because the Germans forbid them from crossing and invading and pushing on with their victory. In the spring of 1916, the Allies begin to advance from the birdcage line. You then have, in the summer, a Bulgarian offensive, an Allied counter-offensive, and then an Allied offensive, which captures the Macedonian city of Monastir. And then you have nearly 2 years of sporadic fighting, above all in the spring of 1917, when the Allies launched an unsuccessful offensive across much of the front. And its failure left Allied troops at Salonika in the doldrums by mid-1917. During the summer, the French, the Serbians, and the Russians, they all suffer from unrest and mutiny. And at the same time, the British commitment to Salonika declined. So 2 British divisions, the 10th Irish Division and the 60th 2nd London Division, are sent to Palestine to join the Egyptian Expeditionary Force under Allenby. And then further troops are sent to the Western Front in early 1918, after the British Army across the First World War is restructured when they go from 4 battalion to 3 battalion brigades. But in the summer of 1918, Allied fortunes in Macedonia changed. As the tide turned on the Western Front, as the German spring offensives had been halted, and then the Allies go on the offensive, Allied political and military decision makers decided that it was time to launch an offensive in Macedonia. General Franchet d'Espèrey, the French commander-in-chief of the Allied armies at the time, envisaged an offensive over the Maglena Mountains, which was spearheaded by the Serbians, by the 1st and 2nd armies, and then supported by 2 French divisions. Elsewhere, the Allies were to launch operations to support the main effort. So you have the French army of the east that attacks towards Prilep, and then the British, they attack around a place called Doiran. And the British Salonika force, under Lieutenant General Sir George Francis Milne, faced a considerable challenge at Doiran. So first and foremost, Milne lacked the manpower and materiel he considered necessary to assault such a strong enemy position, particularly in terms of the heavy artillery needed to knock out the Bulgarian positions or the gas shells that he wanted to use to compensate for this. Because his 12 Corps had actually attacked west of Lake Doiran, the map shown on the left, the previous year, in April and May, as part of the First Battle of Doiran, which is part of the Allied offensive across the front. Because attacking on the night of the 24th to the 25th of April 1917, British troops had suffered 3,163 casualties during the week up to the 29th of April. They then had to renew the assault again because the main Allied effort that they were trying to divert Bulgarian attention from was delayed. So they go in on the 8th, the night of the 8th to the 9th of May, and then they suffer a further 1,861 casualties on the 8th of May alone. And in September 1918, 12 Corps had to attack again over the same ground. On the other side of the wire, they have faced the well-motivated and well-led 9th Pleven Division. It occupied a formidable natural fortress atop the rugged hills and ravines of the region. They had trenches and shelters that were blasted out of solid rock and reinforced with concrete. There were concrete artillery positions, observation posts, machine gun posts, and trench mortar emplacements. So from an observation post that I'll show you a picture of in a subsequent slide, which was known as the Devil's Eye, atop the towering Grand Coronet, the Bulgarians could gaze over the British rear area as it stretched towards Salonika. And so for British troops, there was a real feeling of nakedness when you're in the Doiran sector, because it seemed that the enemy could see you wherever you were going. This time, though, the British also attacked northeast of the Lake Doiran, as you can see on the map on the right. So the British 16 Corps, which had spent most of the campaign on the Struma front, it was to attack the less heavily fortified positions of the Blaga Planina, which were held by a lesser quality Bulgarian formation, the 1st Macedonian Brigade. But such an operation there was complicated by the need to advance over an open plain that had very little cover, besides some isolated villages and woods. But success was further complicated by the fact that it rested on inter-allied cooperation, because General Milne had received 2 Greek divisions to bolster his understrength force, which by this point, after the best part of 3 years in Macedonia, was suffering from, its ranks were tired physically by malaria. They were just getting hit by Spanish flu, so one British brigade can't actually participate in the initial assault because there's too many sick. So he gets 2 Greek divisions, whose identity is quite important here, because they're the Sers and the Cretan divisions of the Army of National Defence, which were to spearhead the attacks of 12 Corps and 16 Corps, respectively. Because if we refer back to the division of Greece in 1916 between the government of Venizelos, the original government of national defence, and the royalist Greek government under King Constantine in Athens, these men, the Sers and the Cretan divisions, they are troops that Venizelos raised to fight with the Allies. Because although Greece is now reunited as part of the Allies, the armies remain distinct. So you have the Royal Greek Army, which was previously neutral, that's still there, but you have the Army of National Defence units as well. And this is important because during the spring of 1918, the British 16 Corps had fought with the Greek 1st Corps, the Royal Army. So they had experience fighting with the Greeks on the ground. And Milne had wanted men from these units to be assigned to his forces for the Battle of Doiran, but he's overruled by General Franchet de Esperey, who thinks that the volunteers of the Venizolist army would actually prove superior to the previously suspect Royal Greek army. But for those on the ground, the tensions of the preceding period between the Allies and Constantine, irrespective of the identity of the Greek soldiers that they were actually going to be fighting with, weighed heavily on their encounters. So from the outset, as soon as they arrived at Salonika, the British had developed a thoroughly negative impression of the Greeks as soldiers. So Vincent Julian Seligman, an officer serving the Army Service Corps, later noted the complexities of fighting alongside allies in general and the Greeks in particular. So in his memoir, he wrote, quote, "Disparagement of the qualities of one's allies is, I'm afraid, common enough. To the Greeks especially, with whom 2 years previously our relations had been, to say the least, strained, it is not likely that our men would be inclined to give undue praise. Yet from all the officers and men who fought shoulder to shoulder with them, I never heard anything but words of unstinted admiration for the bravery and dash of the Greek Johnnies." So the Johnny is a moniker that the British like to apply to the Greeks, to the Bulgarians, and to the Macedonian population in general. So it's a very generic term. but you can get the sentiment. And so then when the Greek troops start to arrive at the front before the offensive, the British immediately begin to assess their counterparts based on their appearance. So one officer considered them, quote, very fine-looking men. Lieutenant A. Bundy, whose papers are here at the museum, he felt that they were, quote, surprisingly tough and seemed quite determined. But he held out little hope that the Greeks would actually succeed because he compared them to the Serbians, which were going to spearhead the Allied offensive, because the Serbians appeared, quote, splendid soldiers, definitely keen on killing Bulgars. But the one positive that he did take overall was that the fact that the Greeks were going to spearhead the offensive. So it seemed that they were going to take on the burden of fighting, and the British would be spared a repeat of the previous year. But his conviction that they would fail, it left open the concerning possibility that the British would actually have to fight. And this was something that filled him with a bit of dread. So on the 15th of September, 1918, the Allied offensive opened with the Franco-Serbian assault at Dobropol. It broke through the Bulgarian defences. Then, on the morning of the 18th of September, in full knowledge of the Allied success west, British and Greek troops attacked at Doiran. Now, neither the attack of 12 Corps nor 16 Corps succeeded on the 18th. On the 19th, 12 Corps renewed the attack, and the attack failed again. Now, defeat principally stemmed from operational and tactical shortcomings, including the inadequate preliminary and supporting barrages, the physical weaknesses of the attackers who were afflicted by influenza and worn down by years of service in Macedonia, and the failure of the French support on the 19th of September, because there was a French Zouave battalion who was blamed for not having gone forward and leaving the British exposed. But interestingly, the British official account of the battle also criticised the coordination between the British and Greek troops. Because apart from one of its regiments, which had served on the Struma, the British official historian noted that the Serres division, fighting alongside 12 Corps, had no experience cooperating with the British, but had nevertheless come under British orders, was attacking in an unfamiliar sector, and was supported only by British artillery. Worse still, one of its regiments had been incorporated into a British division and then had attacked with British units either side when it could have been used to follow up the success of the Greek troops. Employing the Cretan division with the 16 Corps to the northeast of the lake appeared an even worse decision, and the official historian suggested that the Greek First Corps, the Royal Greek Army, which had previously served with the Greeks on the British on the Struma, should have been deployed, given it was familiar with British methods. But if you look on the ground, of course, it's unclear how just switching the Greek units would have actually benefited anything for the ordinary soldier. Because, first and foremost, the principal difficulty was that of language, an obstacle that inter-unit familiarity wouldn't have eased. Because finding that the commander of the Cretan division spoke no English, the one British officer from the 130th Brigade Royal Field Artillery had to try and work out the artillery support for the attack that was ongoing based on his schoolboy French knowledge, which doesn't seem particularly useful in the conditions of battle. But things were positive, at least in the British eyes, because the attack didn't stop the British from reaching a positive conclusion of Greek military capabilities. Several noted their bravery and fighting spirit. One noted the positive sentiments of all who had fought alongside the Serres division, and then wrote of the dash and bravery of the Cretan division. Even Lieutenant E.A. Bundy found much to praise, undoubtedly wrote in his belief in his diary at the time that the Greeks had actually succeeded, because he believed that the Cretan division had routed the Bulgarians. So in his diary, he exclaimed that, quote, they were mowed down by machine gun fire, but pressed on. It was amazing. I never would have believed they had the courage. By 5:30, they'd captured the Bulgar front line, and we could see the enemy bolting away like rabbits. Others, though, took a different perspective. So they appreciated the enthusiasm of the Greek troops, but nonetheless, it seemed to be a factor in why they'd been defeated, because after capturing the Bulgarian outpost line, Lieutenant V. Farmer recalled that, quote, flushed with success, they figuratively shouted victory and rushed headlong into the Bulgarian main line to be met with withering machine gun fire, soon followed by enemy shell fire and British shell fire, because they jumped their barrage. They were completely shattered and came back through our lines in utter disorder. On other parts of the battlefield, you get vehement criticism from the 77th Brigade, where the officer there, Major Christopher Wyndham Hughes, he blamed the Sers Division for his brigade's failure, because he recalled in his memoir that there had been hundreds and hundreds of Greeks without rifles running away towards our lines. And this had exposed the flanks of his brigade, while the division clung to the hope that the Greeks hadn't run away and then refused his unit permission to withdraw. But in all, the British and Greek forces at Doiran sustained 7,103 casualties, about half of which belonged to the Sers and Cretan divisions. On the other side of the wire, Bulgarian casualties amounted to less than 3,000. So tactically, it was a failure in terms of ground seized and casualties suffered. But strategically, the Greco-British assault at Doiran successfully tied down Bulgarian troops and prevented their movement westward to stem the Allied advance achieved by the French and the Serbians at Dobropol. And as it continued, the victorious Bulgarian defenders who'd repelled the British twice now, in two different battles, they were compelled to withdraw. So on the 20th of September, the dark skies around Doiran were lit up as the Bulgarians blew up their stores and then withdrew. And a campaign that had previously been one of inertia, inactivity and futility, it burst into life as the pursuit of the retreating Bulgarians began. The Royal Air Force harasses the Bulgarians from the sky, and on the ground, British and Greek troops are following up Bulgarian rearguards. And then faced with defeat and the prospect of invasion, the Bulgarians signed an armistice on the 29th of September, which came into effect the following day. And the Bulgarians were the first of the Central Powers to sue for peace. And in the decades that followed, those writing the first drafts of wartime history lauded the fruits of inter-allied cooperation. There's one officer, Captain A.J. Mann, who served the Royal Flying Corps. He examined in his account the French, Russian, Italian, Serbian, Greek and British efforts in turn, where, quote, the final fusion of which resulted in the victory of our arms. But Allied comradeship symbolically persisted after the war at Zaitenlik Cemetery at Thessaloniki. So on the screen you have the British section on the left, the French section in the middle, and then part of the Serbian section. And there's also Italian sections and Russian sections as well. And so General Milne, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Salonika Force, in the Times, writing in 1928, he declared that, quote, British, French, Serbian, Greek and Russian lie side by side in lasting memory of a great alliance. And although he forgets the Italian troops, whose own cemetery there is quite neglected today, I think that's a very fitting testimony to end this talk and bring it to a close. So thank you very much for listening.